Hello, welcome back to Asian Cinema Season 2 and another review of a Mamoru Hosoda film. I always have trouble pronouncing his name, and I probably didn't get it correct then either. But this is his most recent film, which was in fact nominated for the Academy Award for Best Animated Film this year in 2019. Didn't win, unfortunately, but I think that the better film won in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which is a completely different film for a completely different video and review, of which we've already done anyway. Regardless, we're here to talk about Mirai, which is apparently the Japanese word for future, or it is linked to the word future. I don't know if it means future or if it just kind of has a connotation of it, I don't know. But regardless, it is a really touching tale of a young boy who's maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4, maybe 5 at a stretch, who is struggling with the jealousy he feels when he has a new sister, who is a young baby. That's the film. He is struggling with the jealousy and eventually learns a few life lessons from all of his family through space and time, all linked by this tree that rests in the family garden. And this tree is supposed to, I guess, represent kind of the family tree, so to speak, which is a little bit on the nose. But from time to time, he'll be in the garden, and that tree will transport him to another time and place, where he will either meet the human manifestation of the family dog, or he will meet Mirai, his sister, who at that point in this vision is a teenage girl. And so the idea of a young boy struggling with the idea that he's not the only kid in town anymore, and that his parents are kind of diverting their attention to someone else too, and he really can't handle this, to be guided through that by this spectre of his sister, who is now, a 16-year-old, is a very bizarre and wacky and yet kind of really touching concept, I think, because, he's older than her, but to have her then be so much older than him and kind of try and guide him through all of this. And it's not just her as well, it's also one of my favorite moments of the film is when he actually comes across his mother when she was his age. And so he gets to kind of go home with his mum when they're both kind of little kids and they're running around the house and kind of having fun together. And you get to realize where he gets some of his kind of rambunctiousness from. Is that even a word? That I just feel like I plucked that out of my head from nowhere. It's a word I haven't used in a very long time, if it even is a word. Regardless, he's very boisterous. You can see where he gets some of his traits from when he meets his mother at that age. And that brings this concept of, what were your parents like when they were your age? And you can apply that to yourself when you're 30, when you're 20, when you're 10, 5, and wonder, would we have been friends? And that's one of the great things about Back to the Future, is, the idea of, what were my parents like in high school? Would we have, hung out? That kind of thing. And so Mirai takes that to a bigger extreme, where he's hanging out with his mother as a young, kind of, a very young child. And then also, again, it goes to different points in his family that there's a little bit of mystery there as to who certain people are. Is that his father? Is that his grandfather? Is it his great-grandfather? How far back does this thing go? It goes to the future, to the past, to the present. What is it real? What's the limits to this thing? I before I get further into that, I really loved the main location of the film, which is the house. And we start the film panning down to the town where the family live, right down to the house, which is a very typical house on a very typical street. And then we see that the house gets kind of torn down and rebuilt into this very modern kind of stepped house, where it's kind of it's like a concept house. And I think the father is an architect, and so he designed the house. And I just love the style of it. It's really cool and modern and interesting, and it just makes for a great different kind of location to set the film, where, again, it is all in that house. Until the young boy actually goes off into these kind of fantastical adventures. It does suffer a little bit from comparisons, to me, to Miyazaki's films, where My Neighbor Totoro comes to mind. A very young child kind of going off and having these fantasy adventures and maybe learning a thing or two, and then also Spirited Away at one point when he kind of gets lost and can't get back. So it's one of those things where Miyazaki was just so incredible at telling these larger-than-life fantasy tales that are grounded in very human characters in the form of Japanese animated movies that when you deal with that, yourself, as, in the case of Hosoda, a Japanese animation director, you're gonna have those comparisons if you decide to dip your toes into fantasy. It depends which way you go with it, but I do feel like there are some comparisons that just make me go, oh, it's a bit like Spirited Away, not as good, and it's tough, it really is tough, but it's not a big detractor from the film, but it's certainly something that I thought about. Certainly not as much as, say, Shinkai's Journey to Agatha, which to me was just so Miyazaki light that it kind of really reflected negatively on the overall experience. It's not as much in this film, but I do think that there are echoes of it that are quite obvious. But regardless, I think that the interesting thing about Mirai is that I read a lot of reviews, or at least thoughts on Letterboxd from various different viewers, and a lot of them were mainly kind of annoyed at the fact that there's a lot of just a kid being a little brat, basically. He's throwing temper tantrums, he's crying a lot, because he's not getting the attention he feels like he deserves. He's jealous. At one point, he strikes his young sister, who, again, is just a baby, and it's shocking. It's like, holy shit, he just hit his sister with, I think it's like a toy train. And it's just like, whew. And it really kind of, I loved how it showed you how difficult it is to be a parent as well. Often in these animated films, parenthood seems like such a beautiful and wonderful thing. In fact, I could say, in My Neighbor Totoro, that parenthood seems like such a warm and easy thing to the father. Obviously, there's different elements where, the mother's away and things, but I will say that the realism injected into that section of this film, I don't know why I'm comparing it to Miyazaki, because it really is quite different, but again, it's difficult to get that out of my head when certain elements of the fantasy side of Mirai come into play. We'll leave Miyazaki out of this for now, okay? We'll just forget that and judge it on its own merits, as it should be, I think. There's a lot of humor in the film that I found really endearing and funny, which isn't a surprise coming from, Hosoda's other film that I've seen, The Girl Who Leapt Through Time. And so, he really seems to be a director who has a handle on humor and how to play it and how to pitch it as well. My favorite moment of the film is undoubtedly when the boy ends up visiting his grandfather. At first he believes it's his father, and this actually might be spoiling things. So at this point, if you're interested in seeing the film, I highly recommend you check it out. It isn't like, and it feels strange when I try and justify this. I'm like, well, it's not a great, like, it's not a masterpiece, but it's still great, as if that's somehow going to reflect negatively on it. Not every film needs to be a masterpiece. So no, it isn't as great as certain other Japanese anime films, but it's still pretty damn great, and it's still worth checking out. I think it was fairly mixed as far as the audience and critics go. I think a lot of people liked it, but thought it could have been better. And perhaps other elements of the film could have been executed better, but I think for the most part, I think it's a really touching and I would say relatable story as far as the depiction of parenthood, but I'm not a parent, so I couldn't really, but it felt like a realistic depiction of that. And so I feel like with these animated stories, when you add a lot of human elements, it just makes you relate to the characters a lot more easily than you would in other animated films, where it's just more about kind of the action of what's going on and the plot. But to have those little details there of it's tough for the parents, and they're trying to work their way through it, and they're tired, and they're stressed. I just think that all adds to it and makes you believe the characters more. It makes them feel more like actual living, breathing people, as opposed to cartoon characters, which is essentially what they are. So anyway, I highly recommend you check the film out. Vague spoilers from here on out. So my favorite part of the film was when the young boy visits his grandfather. So this is many decades ago, in fact. And his grandfather takes him for a ride on a horse and teaches him how to ride a horse. And then also takes him for a ride on his motorbike. And in the real world, the boy is struggling with riding a bike for the first time. And he's really frustrated about this. And he can't just let go and do it. There's that fear that he has. And after he's had that kind of visit with his grandfather, he goes to ride his bike again, and he still can't get it, and then he remembers what his grandfather taught him. through time and space. And it works, and he learns how to ride this bike, and it was from a lesson imparted to him by, you know, someone who died many years ago. I think there's just something really sweet about that. But just in general, the way the sequence was drawn and animated and scored by the music was really beautiful when they're driving along on the bike and everything. And it was really, really sweet. And part of that was the kind of culmination of the grandfather storyline, because at one point the adults in the film are sat around and talking about the grandfather, the father of one of the parents. I forget who it was now, if it was the father of the mother or the father of the main boy. Making sense? Because I'm not. It doesn't sound like I am. Regardless, the adults are talking about, oh, well, there's that old story where your dad said to your mum, all those decades ago, that if I beat you in a race, then you'll marry me. A little bet, a playful bet, if you will. And they go, well, no, that's just a story. They just like to tell that story, but he had a bad leg since the war, so he couldn't run. That thing never happened. It's just a sweet story they tell sometimes. And the young boy, our main character, when he's having his final visit through time and seeing all these different perspectives on his family at different moments in the past, present, and future, he sees from above his grandfather and his grandmother having that race. And the way it plays out is really beautiful, because you see that race did happen, that he did have that bad leg. But it plays out in an entirely different way, where the story still works, but there's a different twist on it, which is really, really touching. So that was my favorite element of the film. And just in general, the idea of the young boy being guided through his kind of jealousy, I suppose, by an older version of the girl he was jealous of as a toddler. So that was really cool, I think. Just a unique way to tell a story. Anyway, I thought it was great. Really, really enjoyed it. I look forward to revisiting it, and again, perhaps like certain bits weren't as successful as others. There's certainly higher points than there are kind of lower points, but at the same time, not every film is going to work for you from start to finish. I don't think this one does for me completely. But overall, I loved it. I really did. So I feel like I'm just looking for stuff to nitpick because I didn't fully love it. And that's kind of maybe the wrong way to look at it. But Mirai, I think, was a great film. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you for watching. If you've seen the film, please leave your thoughts down below. And I will see you in the next one.
It's alright by me. Apart from the fact he throws cans and calling into a tree. Yeah, he's really cool. Yeah, he's really cool. But he's not quite as cool as you.